So good morning everyone and welcome to this Health Flicks session on writing with both hands, so writing with the dominant hands and the non-dominant hands, and we'll explore a little bit together why that can be beneficial and a really interesting thing to explore. So a book that's really interesting to read about this is The Power of Your Other Hand by Lucia, I think you pronounce it Cappuccione, Lucia Cappuccione, The Power of Your Other Hand. So before we begin, let's have a go and let's do it. So there's an invitation to take, if you haven't already got one close by, feel free to pop off and get one. Piece of paper, you might have a notebook or even pieces of coloured cards, some pencils, coloured pencils, pens, whatever writing implement you have to hand. And then taking that piece of paper and that writing implement, so I often like using a pencil for these purposes, and taking your pencil in your non-dominant hand. So if you're right-handed, taking it in your left hand, and if you're left-handed, taking it in your right hand. And then we're going to write our name. So I'm Nicole Schnackenberg, and I think I'll write the whole thing. If you have your original name, your sort of pre-married name, if you've taken on a married name or indeed any other name, you might like to also go back to that. So the name you would have written in your books as a child. So taking the non-dominant hand, the pencil or the pen in your non-dominant hand, and taking a moment to write your name. And allowing yourself to be nice and slow with this. Often, well, almost always writing with that non-dominant hand, unless we're used to doing it, will slow us down in any case. And seeing if we can let go of any judgment about the process. So I'm going to do it along with you. Just noticing how it feels to write your name with your non-dominant hand. Taking a moment also to notice how the letters are forming. Any feelings it might bring up. Not worrying if it doesn't bring anything up, these are just possibilities. And there we are, and then taking a moment to notice or observe what you've written. And we'll come back to having another go at writing with our non-dominant hands with a little practice shortly. So why is this interesting to us? Well, handedness has been of interest to humanity for a very long time and cross-culturally as well. So we are a right-handed dominated society. About 90% of us cross-culturally are right-handed. That means about 10% of us are left-handed, and there's a very tiny proportion of the population that are ambidextrous, that use both hands easily, but that's a really tiny proportion of the population. Most estimates suggest less than 1%. And this handedness we would have probably become secure in around the age of 3 or 4 years old. It's very much connected with the development of language and also connected with motor development. So thinking about the hemispheres of the brain, so the right hand being controlled by the left hemisphere and the left hand by the right hemisphere. So there's also something about a connection with emotion and logic and language actually. So for the majority of us, not all of us, and this is really interesting, and it's an area of research that continues as to why this might be and the mechanisms behind that. But 98% of right-handers have language centres in the left hemisphere. So the left hemisphere being the hemisphere connected with logic and linearity, and then the other L being language. But what that means though is that 2% of right-handers have their language centre in the right hemisphere of the brain, which is traditionally associated with emotion and interoception, the lived experiences of the body from the inside. And then about 2/3 of left-handers also have language centres in the left hemisphere. So what that means is the vast majority of the population have their language centre in the left hemisphere of the brain. it also means that some of us don't. And it's not the case that language only occurs in one hemisphere or the other. It just means it's lateralized there, it's dominated there, because many parts of our brain will fire and become involved when we use language. So handedness is really interesting here. And there's something about writing with the non-dominant hand being connected for most people with the right hemisphere, with the hemisphere connected with creativity and intuition and emotion as well. So there's a sense that when we write with our non-dominant hand, including if we're left-handed, there's a connection to that creative aspect of ourselves, that intuitive aspect, that emotive aspect of ourselves. So for that reason, it can be really interesting in terms of kind of communicating between the head and the heart. It's almost as though when we write with one hand and then the other, and when we write with the non-dominant hand, we allow the thinking part of ourselves and the emotive part of ourselves to embrace each other, to connect with one another, because the brain is lateralized for different functions, and one hemisphere of the brain requires inhibition in order for us to inhabit the other. So what that means is, if we are inhabiting the left hemisphere of the brain, that kind of logical linear aspect of the brain, it can be quite hard at the same time simultaneously to connect to our emotional experience, which is one reason why we often feel we can oscillate between having one sense of something from the logical part of ourselves and then having another sense of something in kind of the instinctual part of ourselves. So for the purposes of decision making, for the purposes of unpicking what's coming from the head and the heart and coming from the left and the right hemisphere, it can be really, really helpful. It can also be really helpful in terms of connecting us to the different aspects of the self. So in a moment, we'll explore a little practice that's connected to some of the ideas of internal family systems therapy, and voice dialogue and other approaches also use these kind of ideas. And it's the language of parts. So it's the sense that we all have these different parts inside of us, and often we speak like that in any case. And it's interesting that, the brain has two parts. There's different chambers there's 4 chambers in the heart. There's 2 branches of the autonomic nervous system. There's lots of parts physiologically within us, sort of split aspects of self. And there's also split aspects of self in the emotional realm and the psychological realm also. And we use this language in the everyday. So, for example, this morning the sun was shining, so part of me was ready to leap out of bed and looking forward to coming here and spending some time with you. And then another part of me was quite cosy in the bed and would have perhaps quite liked to have stayed there a bit longer. So, these 2 parts of myself having 2 different ideas or desires about how I'd like to start my day. And similarly, we can see these parts in others. We might have an experience of somebody at one time being a particular way, and then half an hour later it feels like we're in the room with a completely different person. And of course we're not. It's just the case that we all have these different aspects of ourselves. And in the discipline or the approach of internal family systems, and in many other approaches, there's a sense that there are parts of ourselves that are kind of culturalized in or socialized in. So they're not kind of innate to us from the moment we are born and perhaps even in the womb. And yet there's a part of ourselves that is our birthright, that is innate, that has nothing to do with our social experiences, our attachment, our relational experiences, life events. It's there always. This sense, as Donald Winnicott would have called it, a British psychoanalyst, the true self, or as Carl Jung would have called it, the self with a capital S. And this is the self that is unchanging across time and space. It's the self that's the same when we're 2 years old and 22 and 82 and 102, if we reach that old. It's unchanging in a sense, and it has these key qualities. And we can think of these key qualities as the 8 C's, the 8 C's of the self, the true self, the deepest self. And those are compassion, So it's innately compassionate in all circumstances. Curious, and that's a really interesting one that we'll explore in our practices in a moment, this open sense of curiosity as opposed to judgment. In every situation there's the possibility, isn't there, to judge or to be curious, and the deepest aspect of ourselves is always curious, wants to understand and wants to really see whatever is occurring. So curiosity, compassion, courage, deep sense of courage, clarity, clear thinking, connectedness, a sense of connection to all things, calmness, creativity, and what have I forgotten? Confidence. It's kind of self-assured. It knows what it wants, actually. Maybe other parts of ourselves might be battling a bit. The core self, the true self, knows what it desires and knows the right action to take in every situation. And it's not the case that we have to somehow create this true self, because it's our birthright, it's there. It can just be that there can be times when it's easier, or perhaps feels easier to access it than other times. And that is when the other parts of ourselves can release the burdens that they're holding for us, release the jobs that they're having to do in order to, in the kind of felt sense of belief of those parts, keep us safe. Because all of the other parts, in a sense, have a protective function. And if that makes, at the moment, not so much sense, perhaps it will make more sense when we engage in a little practice together. And the beauty of writing with the non-dominant hand is that we can begin to access those parts of ourselves that we might perhaps less often access, because they may be the parts we have a greater propensity to push away. So vulnerability is a big one. And I know that when I write with my non-dominant hand, there's a big feeling of vulnerability, a big feeling of awkwardness that comes up. It feels a bit awkward. It's the unschooled hand. It's unusual. It feels unusual to write with that hand. But also this sense of vulnerability, the sense of a younger part of myself, actually a childlike part of myself. We could say the inner child, with the inner child having itself different aspects. The vulnerable inner child, the inner child that's the childlike young part of ourselves that's been hurt, and perhaps therefore become a little bit stuck in that hurt, including stuck in patterns to soothe the self and save the self from that hurt. And then the magical child, the child that loves adventure and imagination, and at any age wants to build dens and dig things out of the ground and explore the world. And then this playful child, and the spontaneous part of ourselves, the spontaneous sense of aliveness that we all have. And writing with the non-dominant hand can support a bit of an access to these aspects of the self, which can be really revelationary and really supportive in our journey through life. And particularly perhaps at the moment, those vulnerable parts of ourselves, that part of ourselves that tends to react quite strongly to unpredictability, to fear, to uncertainty, could be very strongly there right now with the current COVID-19 experience that we're all in together. And this uncertainty and unpredictability and this fear that's there, and understandably so, maybe bringing that vulnerable part out very strongly, and then we could have all sorts of reactions to that. It might be those 8 C's of the kind of core self, where we're just curious about it, and we're confident in our ability to embrace that and hold it, and we are calm in our approach to it, and we're courageous in our in what we do with it. And there can also be, and this is, none of this is with judgment, it's just the natural patterning of the human experience. There can also be a fear of the fear, or a sense of vulnerability ignited by that vulnerability, and therefore a propensity to push it down, to ignore it, to make ourselves really busy when those feelings of vulnerability and fear come up, or escaping into certain practices and processes that we believe will save us or soothe us, or will dampen down those feelings that we're having. And of course the difficulty there is that these feelings, they're telling our story. They're often telling a very long story, because they often are very young aspects of the self, so they've been around for a long time. And they will continue to knock on the door of our hearts, it seems, until their story has been told and their energy has played itself out. And a sense that the more we perhaps push them down or cover them over with our busyness or use of substances or whatever it is that we might go to, particularly in times of high stress such as this one, that they're going to continue to knock louder and louder and louder. So actually a process of connecting with these parts, including this vulnerable, fearful part of ourselves, and also writing to it with the dominant hand and then from it with the non-dominant hand, can be incredibly relieving for those parts of ourselves. It allows them to tell their story. And when they're told their story and they've played out their energy, they're able then to come into their naturally valuable state. So all the parts of us, including the parts of us that we might be the most fearful of or that we spend the most time trying to push down, you know, the aggressive parts, the confused parts, the frightened parts, they all have a naturally valuable state. They're all there for the good. You know, they may have taken on certain burdens, and all of these things that we do to soothe ourselves are adaptive. None of them are maladaptive because they all worked at a certain point in time. They, in a naturally valuable state, the energy is for our good. The parts of ourselves that are often the most difficult and the ones we reject the most are the parts of ourselves working the hardest to protect us. And they're doing the best job they can with what they've learned and the resources that they have. We are doing the best job we can with the resources we have, which is why it doesn't make sense ever to beat ourselves up or to call any of our behaviours maladaptive. It just might be that some of the things that we go to soothe ourselves are no longer serving us. They're a bit out of date. That's all. And this process can serve to update those parts of ourselves, to enable them to relax, to release their burdens, to come back into their naturally valuable state, so that that true self has even more space to heal, I guess. And we know that healing is happening when all of those aspects are there. The curiosity is there, the compassion is there, self-compassion being so, so important and central to this. So let us engage in a little practice together before we write with our non-dominant hand. So I'll invite you to, you can have the eyes open or closed, or come into a still point, perhaps even 9/10 closed, allowing a little shaft of light in if that feels more comfortable to you. Tucking in the chin to allow you to lengthen through the spine and reach up lightly with the crown of the head as you relax those shoulders down. And through this posture, we can also give a message to our bodies that we're alert and yet calm. And you might like to have the hands down on your lap, or you might like to bring them to your heart, whatever feels most natural and comfortable to you. And then I'll invite you just to take a moment to connect with that vulnerable part of yourself. The part of yourself that holds your vulnerability. And it might be that you connect to it in thought, so it's just a thought of that vulnerability. It might be a feeling, a sensation somewhere in the body. And then you might become curious about where in the body that vulnerability particularly sits. It might be a sense of colour that goes with it, or shape or form. Considering if it has a colour, a shape or a form. Knowing that there are no right or wrong answers. Without judgment, just connecting to this vulnerable part of yourself. And breathing long and deep can really support this process. And taking a moment now to, with curiosity, with openness of heart, Asking this part of yourself how old you were when it came into your life. How old you were when it came into your life. Allowing the thinking part of yourself to relax and an answer or a sense of an answer just to bubble up and to emerge. Not worrying at all if nothing pops up, just continuing to breathe, connecting to this vulnerable part of yourself. Taking a moment now to ask this vulnerable part of yourself how old it thinks you are now. How old it thinks you are now. Again, allowing the thinking part of yourself to relax and an answer just to emerge. For often these parts of ourselves think we're much younger than we are. How old do you think I am? Noticing if your breathing got shallow, continuing to invite that breath down to the bottom of the lungs by expanding the abdomen on the inhale. Taking a moment before we move on just to notice how you feel towards this part of yourself. How do you feel towards this vulnerability? Is it permitted by you? Does it bring up feelings of wanting to push it away somehow? Are you accepting of it, rejecting of it? Just noticing without judgment your feeling towards this vulnerable part of yourself. Taking a moment now to, with curiosity, ask this part of yourself, this vulnerable part, what role or what function it has in your life. What is its job? What does it spend its day doing? What is important to it? What preoccupies it? Allowing that thinking part of yourself to relax and anything that comes to come. There's an invitation to ask now, what is it afraid would happen if it didn't do these things, if it didn't take this role in your life, if it didn't spend its time doing what it does? What is it afraid might happen? And asking now if it could be released of the burden of protecting you, or feeling the need to protect you and keep you safe. It could be released of its burden of fear, this vulnerable part. What job would it like to do? How would it like to spend its energy, its time? What would it like its function, its purpose to be? Breathing long and deep, allowing the thinking part of yourself to relax and any impressions and answers to emerge. Allowing ourselves to be surprised by what might come. Before we finish, just noticing how you feel towards this part now. how you feel now towards this vulnerable part of yourself. Taking a moment to consider if there may be some possibility to extend some compassion, even gratitude to this part for working so hard to protect you in some way. Perhaps even finishing with a gesture, something in your mind's eye, in your imagination, a gesture to this part of yourself, if you wish and feel moved to do so. And let's take a deep breath in together, expanding the abdomen, filling the lungs all the way to the top. Exhaling completely. And taking a moment to reorientate ourselves back towards our paper and our pens and whatever writing implements we have. And when we write with the non-dominant hand, it can be really nice sometimes to take a big fat crayon or chalk, the sorts of writing implements we don't often use as adults, to really again support that connection to that inner part of ourselves that's quite childlike and innocent and very vulnerable. So taking our dominant hand, so if you're right-handed, your right hand, if you're left-handed, your left hand in a writing implement, and just with that dominant hand, writing a question to that part of ourselves that we've just connected with, and a question particularly to support the process of understanding how we can meet the needs of that part of ourselves, because all the parts of ourselves have needs. And when we provide them with those needs, they can relax, actually, and release the burdens they're carrying. So it might be a question like, how can I help you to feel safe? Or something like, how can I soothe you? And what helps you to feel soothed? So taking a moment to write a question like that with your dominant hand, how can I help you to feel safe? What helps you to feel soothed? And now taking, could be another writing implement in another colour. My non-dominant hand really likes pink, which kind of surprised me, but there you are. Taking a pen or a pencil now in your non-dominant hand. So if you're right-handed in your left hand, if you're left-handed in your right hand, and responding. So first reading that question back, taking a few moments, and then just allowing your response to come through your non-dominant hand. When you've done that, you could draw a little picture with your non-dominant hand. Creating art with the non-dominant hand is another lovely way to connect to these inner child parts of ourselves. Moving on to your drawing, when you've completed that part, allowing your non-dominant hand to draw a little image, whatever that part of yourself fancies. Sometimes we can be quite surprised by the artistic prowess or capacity of our non-dominant hand. It often has its own unique style, way of expressing. When we engage in practices like this, it can be really helpful to make sure we have some uninterrupted time so that we don't feel rushed with it, that we can have a private space with our pens and our pencils or our paints, whatever it is, and the ability to allow this process to be quite slow and meditative in a sense as well. I'm just finishing off my little drawing with my left hand because I'm right-handed typically. And this can also become a back and forth conversation. So if we have more time, and you might like to try this yourself at other times, you can then go back to your dominant hand and respond to that part. So I can show you what I've done. You can see that. So I asked, how can I help you to feel safe with my right hand? And my left hand said, I would like you to ask for a hug when you need it. And then I could then respond with my dominant hand and say, okay, I'm willing to try that. I'm willing to ask for a hug. Do you have any suggestions of people that you feel safe and comfortable with that I could easily ask for a hug? And obviously in the current situation, we're probably giving air hugs. And therefore, I might like to ask that right brain's part of myself and respond with my non-dominant hand. So how else can I get that same need met? And I have done this, and it's been for me, wrapping a blanket very tightly around myself, connecting through the voice to other human beings. So sort of a voice hug, if you like, that tone of voice. It's interestingly, even though the language centre is typically in the left side of the brain, prosody, intonation, is a right-brained thing, which is so interesting. So we can get the same needs met in different ways. Can also, this is something Joy T. Manuel spoke about in her Health Fix talk yesterday, can also give ourselves a hug. Perhaps whilst we're having a chat to someone else, so we're getting that relational connection at the same time. But even in those moments that we're alone, we can give that to ourselves also. So I hope that's been a little bit interesting in some way. It'll be nice to open up to some questions. And I would just finish by saying perhaps that you have fun with it. It's nice to get a great big canvas and do some painting with the left hand and see, or the right hand if you're left-handed, with the non-dominant hand, and see what emerges, and allow ourselves to be surprised by what emerges. And that aspect of it being a younger part of ourselves, and the aspect of it often believing that we are younger than we are, is part of the reason the fears can feel so inflated. So, when I connect to that vulnerable part of myself and I ask it, how old do you think I am? It always comes back with the age of about 6 years old. Now, at 6 years old, we have a lot less, typically have a lot less opportunity to respond in ways. We have a lot less options of ways to respond, let's say, in moments of fear. So often we can't run away and escape. Often we can't fight back because we're so small and don't have that strength. And that part of ourselves often believes that still to be the case, that we still don't have many options available to us, so that when something like this happens, the current COVID-19 pandemic, it believes there's nothing, I can't do anything about it. And of course, there's a lot that we are called to deeply accept because it's outside of our control in this particular experience. However, the ways that we can respond, we have many ways as adults that we can respond, in many ways as adults, lots of tools we can use to soothe ourselves. And so something I find very helpful and do very regularly when those anxieties and those vulnerabilities are really ignited is to place my hands on my heart, lengthen through my spine, which supports a sense of that I've grown since I was 6. I'm not this big anymore, okay, I'm not much bigger, to be honest with you, but I am bigger. So to lengthen through the spine, to let that part of myself know, actually, I've grown since then. And then just to let it know, actually, I'm 37. I'm 37 years old. And I say that as I lengthen through my spine to update that vulnerable part of myself, and also my amygdala, the smoke alarm part of my brain that believes that I'm still 6 years old, that actually I'm not, I'm grown. And then I might take a moment to remind myself of all the tools I have in my toolbox to soothe myself at any particular time. So let's see if there are any questions. You're very welcome to use the Q&A function or the chat function. I can see some things in the chat there. So it says, how often is it, thank you to Philippa, how often is it helpful to carry out this practice? When going through a vulnerable stage, is it important to do this practice or at any time? I see, so particular times to do it. There's often a practicality, isn't there? So when we, especially in this time when we might be living in close proximity to others, some of us are, some of us aren't. But when we can, would be the most practical answer, I suppose. Going back to that aspect of when we have the opportunity to have some uninterrupted quiet time, even if it's 4 minutes of uninterrupted quiet time, but it's 4 minutes we know we won't be interrupted, that we can sit down and engage in this process in a non-rushed way. Again, a lovely way to start the day, a lovely way to perhaps finish the day, to express some of those experiences before we go to sleep at night, so that those vulnerable and fearful parts of ourselves don't feel the need to keep us awake or to process things through nightmares, because they have had their story told and they have been able to be soothed in some way. But particularly also when the vulnerable parts are triggered or are being called up, when we notice ourselves going into behaviours in order to either push down these vulnerable parts of ourselves or to try and soothe them in some way. And we all have our own unique ways of doing that would have been adaptive at a certain point in time. So if it's that we go to the fridge and we eat more food than our body needs, or we go to the internet and we spend hours on there so that we don't have to feel the feelings that we're feeling related to that vulnerability, or whatever practice it is, when we notice those propensities coming up, without judging them, taking out our pens and our paper and taking a moment to write with the dominant hand, perhaps asking a little question, or even just going straight into the non-dominant hands and allowing itself to express what it's experiencing right now. You know, we might ask with our dominant hands, why are you sending me to the fridge right now? And we might find the left hand saying, well, actually, I'm really afraid if you sit down and feel these emotions, you're not going to be able to cope, you're going to freak out. The dominant hand might ask, well, how can I support you not to feel, to not freak out, to be able to cope? And often there's an answer there, and it's a very simple answer. Actually, what I need right now is human connection. Perhaps you could call this person, or to go back to your breathing practice, or to let's paint a picture together, and instead of going to the fridge, or instead of going to whatever it is, whatever behaviour is no longer serving you, and experiencing therefore another way of responding, another way of soothing that part of ourselves, without engaging in behaviours that might later involve shame and that are no longer supportive to us in the present here and now. Thank you, Joyty. It's lovely to have you here as well. We'll just see if there's any. Do feel free to put any questions. I can't see any at the moment, which is completely fine, of course. Maybe you're all still there drawing and writing with your non-dominant hand. Let's have a look. What are the 8 C's again? So the 8 C's come from Richard Schwartz, Dick Schwartz, who is kind of the father of internal family systems therapy. I always forget at least one when I go through them, and then it's often the one that I'm not the best at. So confidence, I forget confidence, so let me start there. Confidence, compassion, curiosity, and I think starting with curiosity in any situation is really a blessing. Confidence, curiosity, compassion, clarity, connectedness, courage, what else? Calmness and creativity. as well. You can look them up, the 8 C's. I think they're called the 8 C's of Self-Leadership by Richard Quartz. And it's a good kind of marker to think, am I being curious in this situation? Am I being compassionate in this situation? Can I access my courage in this situation? And we know that when those things are present, that the true self is present and that healing is occurring, because these qualities are innate to the true self that is beyond all the parts, and that doesn't carry any burdens actually, and in any circumstance has a sense of what needs to be done, or not done actually, just as much. What needs to be let go of, what needs sitting with. Thank you, Philippa. Are there any books you recommend? So I definitely recommend The Power of Your Other Hand by Lucia Cappuccione. It's such a lovely book and such a readable book. She goes through how the left hand used to be demonised in society fairly recently in our history actually. I think sort of 70, 80 years ago we were still forcing children to write with their right hand if they were left-handed. And then she goes for a little bit of the neuroscience, and then in each, I think at the end of each chapter she gives a little practice, really nice practices, and also some examples of how she's used this work. She's an art therapist to support people in different ways therapeutically. So that's a lovely little book, The Power of Your Other Hand. Also, in terms of the whole right brain, left brain aspect and how that connects, the Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist is such a mind-blowingly excellent book. And quite dense, and certainly one where I had to read the same chapter multiple times, but definitely a good use of my time, I found, and gives me the neuroscience to understand how the right and the left side of the body and the right and the left side of the brain connect, how our motor movements also connect with language. It's such a fascinating area, and also therefore how we can access different parts of the brain and different parts of the self through these very simple practices like writing with our non-dominant hand. Okay, we're just coming up to the end here. We have a couple of thank yous. Thank you to Elena and to Lois, I think. Yes. Okay, so thank you very much, and enjoy exploring the power of your other hand, and perhaps dipping into some of the literature as well. And I hope you continue to enjoy these Health Flick talks, and to maintain those connections, talking about one of the 8 C's, those connections with loved ones in whichever way is possible. And indeed experience, as I am very strongly at the moment, a connection between all of us and the world over. With lots of love. Thank you and goodbye.